So I'm going to mention spoilers and use footage from a few different Ace Attorney games, mainly Investigations 2, The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, and Dual Destinies. Consider this your warning. Like pretty much every piece of media that leaves Japan, the Ace Attorney series was translated to other languages. Specifically, the way Capcom handles it is by translating the original script into English, and then translating that English script into French, German, Chinese, whatever. That started with the DS when the re-releases of the Japan-only GBA games received their first official translation. The series was on and off as far as translation went. Most were translated when they first released in Japan, some were skipped for the time being, and I think 2 of the 3DS entries ended up releasing in a different order overseas. With the English release of Ace Attorney Investigations Prosecutor's Gambit last year, over a decade after it came out in Japan, every game is now officially available in English. Now that's partially a good thing and partially isn't. Stick with me here. It's good that people can finally play those games without needing to become fluent in not just the Japanese language, but the occasional plot-relevant diversion into Japanese culture. But as for what's bad about it, yeah, the localization team fucking sucks. Like 4Kids level of localization at some points. I wouldn't say any of the Ace Attorney games had an especially great translation/localization in my eyes, but Prosecutor's Gambit stuck out to me as having plenty of crummy, and in some cases, politically motivated changes to the original script that occurred during the translation process. So before a bunch of NPCs rattle off the pre-programmed, "There's no such thing as a direct translation" retort, I know, very few sentences can be translated one-to-one simply because languages have a lot of nuances and differences between them. You know, like how "Je m'appelle Francois" literally means "I call myself Francois," but it would be translated into English as "My name is Francois." And this principle holds true for Japanese, especially Japanese actually, where a lot less is explicitly stated than in English. There'll be some creative liberties, yeah, because that's just how translation works. One team might translate a line as "it's been a long time since then," while another might translate it as "that was in the past." Obviously that's not censorship. I wouldn't really call either a bad translation. Those are just two different ways of translating something that might not map perfectly into English from its origin language. There's nothing wrong with that because they both convey the same intent and idea, even if the execution is slightly different as a result of the languages not fully lining up. Obviously, Japanese and English are very different. You don't need me to tell you that. But this doesn't give localizers carte blanche to simply rewrite the intent of lines. As a translator, your job is to translate the lines in such a way where the original intent shines through, and that may require some interpretation at times, but at the end of the day, authenticity is key, especially in a mystery visual novel where the characters are a core component of it, and very specific, unambiguous language is needed to make the puzzles function. I mean, this is a series where whole swaths of the mysteries are held up by very specific intentional word choice. I can't overstate just how important it is that the translation be as accurate as possible. This won't be the definitive video on the translation of Ace Attorney Investigations 2, by the way. I don't think any one person could go through every meaningful change and pick apart where the fans' translation is superior, where the official translation is superior, and why these changes exist. I mean, nothing like that can be done in a reasonable time period. Besides, it's not really what I'm trying to accomplish here. I'm trying to explain the general trend in these changes, and in some of these cases, the very overt political reasons why they're being made. And yes, that definitely includes censorship, which will be the main point of this video. My first experience with Ace Attorney Investigations 2, which at the time was called Prosecutor's Path, was a fan translation that released back in 2011. This was mainly done because back then Capcom had no intention of releasing it overseas. It was a labor of love by a really remarkable team that didn't just translate the script, but also redid a lot of the art assets that were originally Japanese, and even re-recorded audio in English. So I started to notice some differences in the script when I watched a friend play the official localization. Obviously I didn't go into it assuming that the fan translation was a more accurate one, though I did expect that. So I looked through the original Japanese script, and yeah, the fan translation tends to keep a lot more of the dialogue intact in most situations. A lot of what I found for this video was by comparing those two versions, but keep in mind I was also cross-referencing them with the Japanese script combined with my almost passable knowledge of Japanese grammar and Google Translate. Later on, where relevant, I'll be backing up the fan translation with screenshots and direct translations from the original script. There's a bit of a weird relationship between these translations. The localization head said that she made sure that neither she nor her team played the fan translation so they wouldn't be influenced by it, which I don't believe that for a second. The official script even references one of the fan names. But the other reason I'm certain about this is because of how hard the official translation tries to avoid overlapping with the fan translations in terms of names. I won't get too deep into the weeds here since it doesn't matter a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but I do want to say that every case name in the fan translation is pretty much directly translated from Japanese, especially the inherited turnabout, the imprisoned turnabout, and the grand turnabout. The fact that we get the second-rate translations of Turnabout Legacy, The Captive Turnabout, and A Turnabout to Remember makes it pretty clear that the translation team was consciously trying to avoid duplicating the names, even if it would be the most logical way to translate those titles. I wouldn't call that censorship. It's stupid, but at least it's not malicious. I'd say making a conscious effort to choose a less accurate translation for outside reasons means you're doing a piss-poor job as a translator, but at the very least, I can't say it's politically motivated. I'm not going to get into the new character names since a lot of that is personal taste, but yeah, a lot of the official names we get for the characters absolutely suck. In particular, the mental gymnastics used to defend the name Eustace Winter as a good name is hilarious. No guys, they chose a stupid fucking name on purpose. And it's funny how far the morons on Reddit will go to slobber over a shitty character name just because their favorite company made it up. So a little background on the series in general. The first Ace Attorney game was translated by a different lead who set it in California, which originally was implied to take place in Tokyo, and began the convention of localizing all the character names. Every subsequent game is translated by a different team led by Janet Shu. Yes, that is how you pronounce her last name, but more on her later. Anyway, all this to say that even though changing the setting from Japan to the US isn't my cup of tea, I at least can't blame the current localization department for that. It was the doing of the previous, also crappy localization department, though believe me, there's plenty of bullshit to blame the current team for. Like I said, the first game takes place in Japan originally, with the localization department setting it in America. I've seen it thrown around that it was a decision made to get a puzzle related to time zones to be more accessible, but to be totally honest, I don't believe that. Much like a lot of works that had their settings changed in localization, this is probably done just to make it easier for Americans to consume and therefore to sell more copies. The prevailing thought at the time was that if a game was too overtly Japanese, it might turn people off, so the solution was to change the setting to a much cleaner, less hellish version of Los Angeles. And that's been retained since, with Prosecutor's Gambit being no exception. Of course, in the original game, all the characters with a few exceptions were Japanese. Yes, even the dark-skinned ones. Japan is, or at least for most of its history, has been pretty close to ethnically homogenous, so it makes sense that pretty much everyone in the cast would also be ethnically Japanese. So then we get the very questionable US localization, and there's not really such a thing as ethnically American unless you're talking about natives. For that reason, some characters were assigned ethnicities by sheer virtue of having a localized name. Like Dee Vasquez, for instance, and she was Japanese in the original, but based on her surname, we can surmise in the localization she'd probably be Spanish or Hispanic or something. Or Matt Angard, obviously that's not a real French surname, but it's at least not out of the question that you could have some French in him. He's no longer Japanese, I mean, is the main thing. You can point to any number of characters that at least have a suggestion of an ethnicity besides their original Japanese identity, now that they've been given a different name. On the surface, I'm not entirely upset by this change. It was bound to happen. It's a natural consequence of setting the series in America. So if they absolutely had to change the setting, I think retaining the Japanese names would have been a little awkward, so I can see why they ended up renaming the cast. What is rather telling, though, is that I don't think I've ever seen anyone really complain about this. In fact, if you so much as question the localization decisions, you would call it a weeaboo. You'd think with how left the internet seems to lean, there'd be at least one moron saying the localization was racist for whitewashing the Japanese cast. But you know, they consider East Asians white anyway, so I guess that's not too surprising. Actually, the fandom loves to blackwash the characters, lending further credence to the fact that they just view the cast as white, despite the fact that they're all Japanese. Frankly, I don't care about the whole racial justice angle because I'm not a but why don't these leftoids care? The localization team literally replaces a cast in some of the game's Japanese identity with an American Western cultural mishmash. You're telling me that's not racist, but space buns are? But I guess double standards are the norm for them, huh? Keep this in mind, by the way, because changing all the characters from Japanese to Americans gave them a bemusing dilemma in Prosecutor's Gambit that I'll talk about later. Now for the part you're probably looking forward to, the ultimate egoist explaining how woke localizers censored what some people call the best Ace Attorney game. But first, let's back up a bit. You're probably wondering how censorship could fit into the whole concept of translation and localization. From what I've already said, it's a fact that some minutiae of the original script will be lost when you translate it. That's unavoidable. Are we going to start calling it censorship when konnichiwa is translated as hello instead of good day or vice versa? No, of course not. The line for when it starts veering into censorship has everything to do with intent and authenticity behind the translation. If you have a line that's being more rewritten than translated, especially for political factors, that's absolutely censorship. The original writer's vision, or at least a version of it that made it into the final product, is being altered to suit a political cause, all without most consumers knowing either. If two distinct people translate the same line as both, I don't care for that plump lady, and, oh, I didn't mean her, then I'm gonna start to wonder why they're so fundamentally different. Is one translator being a diva who thinks they're a writer? Is one of them just crap at translating, or is it politically motivated? For the record, it's most often the last one, but the other two reasons are definitely endemic to this and many other localization departments. What I can say with absolute certainty was politically motivated was what they did to Eddie Fender, known as Raymond Shields in the fan translation. So he's a playful, if slightly lecherous defense attorney. Among many other things, he likes hugs from women and occasionally from men quite a bit. Obviously, the game isn't explicit with it. None of the dialogue is sexual, and it's clearly meant to be a joke. You don't take it too seriously. He asks for physical affection and gets rejected. That's the joke. It's not meant to be funny that he's making women uncomfortable. It's funny that he's so needy and gets shot down at pretty much every occasion. Only a would get offended by that. Let's look at the first case he's introduced in, the captive turnabout. He offers hugs to a few characters. Usually in the official translation, they're written around in a lot less... I can't believe I'm saying this, but in a lot less explicit terms than hugging. You know, like saying, bring it in, chill out, or sometimes just removing the word hug altogether. Making it a lot more of a genuinely friendly thing with no ulterior motives and removing the honestly really funny pretenses he'd put up, like hugging for celebration and stuff. He's also a lot more understanding when he inevitably gets turned down. That's not to say he originally reacted especially poorly when his hug requests were declined, but they've definitely intentionally made him a lot more affirming, like, that's your choice and I respect it, when most of his reactions were generally him feeling caught off guard or defensive in the original. It probably seems like I'm making a huge deal out of something really minute, and to be honest, I am. It's fucking ridiculous that I need to explain that humor in a work of fiction is not the end of the world. But the translators started it when they decided it was so abhorrent that they needed to go outside of their duties of their role to scrub what amounts to G-rated comedy from a game about people getting murdered, children getting kidnapped, and orphans being left to freeze to death. Another example from the captive turnabout, an inmate talks about a fellow prisoner who can provide goods from the outside world, and Eddie wonders if he could get a cute girl before he gets interrupted. See, the official script cuts this line off even sooner, and he wonders if he can get, well, nothing. They just won't even let him say anything. Wanting a cute girl, even in abstract, needs to be cut? Seriously? In a turnabout foreskin, in the fourth case, Fender meets Franziska von Karma and, presumably wanting a dommy mommy GF, says he liked how feisty and cute she is, and then asks for a hug before immediately getting whipped. The official translation, he just compliments her vibe, and still gets whipped for some reason. I don't understand, isn't the original scene the exact kind of feminist torture fantasy these people want? A guy calling a woman cute and getting physically assaulted for it is very much in line with this kind of woke thinking, but whatever. So yeah, hugs are too lewd now. It gets even worse if you can believe it. There's one scene towards the latter section of Case 2 where Gavel, by the way, both the fan translation and the official one gave her really shitty names, hands over an autopsy report to Fender. The joke here is that Fender holds her hands for way longer than necessary because, you know, pretty woman. The Japanese text is also very clear on this, that he's holding her hands a lot longer than would be appropriate in that situation, and he responds with basically, huh? This was rewritten so that he's giving her a handshake instead, and he apologizes immediately rather than giving a perplexed reaction. You know that joke about holding hands being too lewd? Yeah, we've actually reached that point in real life, I guess. There are other examples too, like him not being allowed to say cutie pies anymore, or even saying cute, or even just enchanting. But they're all more of the same. I also want to reiterate that this game is not explicit at all. No woman ever really gets touched, and in the fan translation, the compliments never got any more sexual than the word feisty. Even the censored cat-calling scene from Paper Mario was more raunchy than this. The rewrites aren't really censoring sexual content, which would be wrong anyway, by the way. It's censoring the mere portrayal of a man complimenting women and asking for hugs. Honestly, the fact that they feel the need to remove it makes it seem way more bawdy than it actually is. But what pisses me off more than the censorship, though, is how happy the fandom was about this change, about that facet of this character being reworked pretty majorly between the original and the English localization. The way they talk about the unaltered script is so divorced from reality, taking what's obviously a joke way too seriously. I mean, the way these people talk about Fender, you'd think that he with every woman he comes across. They're glad to have that comedic angle to his character toned down just because it doesn't match their particularly delicate sensibilities. Look, I know in real life it's unacceptable to start propositioning women you just met for hugs, but it's a fucking anime-style video game. You're telling me a hugging joke is so dark that its removal is good? No, needed? Get a grip. You're fans of Ace Attorney, aren't you? Shouldn't you be frustrated at receiving a less authentic version of the game you supposedly care about? Or are your shitty progressive politics more important than artistic integrity? Not sure where else to fit this, but I do want to cover how he talks in the official translation because, well, he talks like a redditor basically, calling Edgeworth Miles or Reno, saying obs instead of obviously, and saying Well, that escalated quickly. His "I'm a bit of an Ace Attorney" line also irked me. I guess when I'm just rattling off lines that struck me as very Reddit, him literally calling Edgeworth a bootlicker is one. He didn't have any notable speaking quirks in the fan translation as far as I can remember, which in my experience is far more faithful to the original script. So while I'll admit I might end up eating three-legged crow on this one, I'm pretty confident in saying he didn't talk like this originally. I can guarantee he never said "you do you" in Japanese. Now, is this censorship? I mean, I wouldn't really call it that. I think it's just the localization team being full of unfunny arts who don't understand that there's probably a reason why they're just translators and not writers. But it is what it is, or rather, you do you. Another set of changes I noticed was related to Delicia Scone. She's not nearly as big a part of the game as Fender, but I do want to mention two things I noticed. Firstly, there's a scene pretty early on in Case 3 where past Fender wonders how old she is, which honestly is completely deserved because she looks exactly the same after an 18-year time skip, but whatever. In the fan translation, Edgeworth, which is to say Edgeworth's father, tells Fender, "A true gentleman never asks a woman's age." In the official translation, he says, "It's not polite to speculate on a person's age." This difference stuck out to me, and I was wondering what exactly the original line was. I did look into it, and it's originally... I'm not going to try to read all that, but the important is the beginning part here. Josei no nenrei, literally the age of a woman or a woman's age. Now, I'll concede that the fan translation did take some liberties here, presumably a Professor Layton reference. That being said, it at least maintained the specific reference to women. There's no other way to interpret that, by the way. The line is absolutely explicit that it's about the age with regards to women specifically. It was intentionally removed when it was translated. Women being sensitive about their age is a very real stereotype. Oh, but we can't stereotype women. No, you can't ask anyone their age. I doubt a man would take offense to it. It's not like they have a reproductive clock constantly ticking down from the moment they reach sexual maturity, but whatever. There was another Delicia moment that falls under one of the stupidest lefty terms I've heard, fat phobia. Brace yourself because this line is incredibly offensive. If you're over 250, you might want to get the rope ready because this is really going to sting. That other plump lady has nothing to do with that. And before you ask, yes, that's pretty much a one-to-one translation of the Japanese original. Specifically the term fuguyokana, which is pretty much always translated as plump. I think it's really telling that they didn't even try to keep the spirit of the line. Surely he could have said curvy or even homely or motherly or she's been living large or something. Not that the team should go with a secondary translation for sensitivity reasons, but I'm trying to put myself in their shoes here. They could have just tried to soften the line, right? But no, they just removed that whole facet of the line altogether. We can't ever acknowledge someone's weight, especially not in terms of how attractive they are. Ever heard of healthy and beautiful at any size, Chud? So yeah, that's another thing you can't say. Put plump in the same category as amigo and slacker, I suppose. Sorry, Plum Pop fans, but your game wasn't good anyway. Alright, here's where I get a bit schizo. This guy, Rocco Carcerato, based on his name, they made him very Italian-American and gave him a sort of Brooklyn Italian manner of speaking. And I have a little theory for why they made his new ethnicity so overt. Remember, in the original, pretty much everyone, including Rocco, was Japanese. He's one of the handful of dark-skinned characters in the series. He's a prisoner. He's meant to look a little bit unscrupulous and rough. If you've read certain kinds of manga, you're probably familiar with this visual archetype. With the localization making him American, though, now he comes across as black, which obviously the localization team wouldn't have the balls to make a violent prisoner have an African or even Latino background, so they made him Italian, a country where some people do have darkish skin, but are still European and therefore okay to depict as prisoners. Like they're saying, no, guys, he's not black, he's just swarthy, I swear. Maybe, probably, I'm reading too much into it, but that'd be absolutely hilarious if true. This next complaint isn't from Prosecutor's Gambit, but I don't really know when else I'll get a chance to bring this up. So going over it very briefly, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is an Ace Attorney game set in early 20th century London, with the majority of the characters being British, aside from the core cast, which is mainly Japanese. So what the localization did that I want to point out is that some of the anti-Japanese racism was toned down a bit. A lot of the British characters don't like and trust the Japanese, and some can get surprisingly aggressive. I shouldn't need to explain why censoring that is. It's historical fiction, basically, and even if we were to look at it through a racial justice lens, it's still anti-Japanese racism being written by a Japanese person. What's the point of trying to scrub some of that off? Actual Japanese people wrote it. You think someone who isn't Japanese can't handle it? Anyway, racial politics caused the racism angle to be toned down in the original. Well, mostly. Magnus McGilded, one of the defendants, was given an Irish ethnicity in the localization, where he was originally implied to be British, like everyone else in London. And yet they made his character Irish just to call him a legitimate slur. No, I'm not kidding. Obviously, I don't care about that. It's fiction, and even besides that, it's set in a time and a place where a lot of people weren't too fond of the Irish. There's nothing wrong with including the word bog trotter in your game, and this is coming from an ethnically Irish and Slovak guy. Yeah, he was the bog trotter pass for you guys. What is wrong, though, is the sheer hypocrisy of the localizers. The Japanese writers depicting characters in the wrong as being racist against Japanese people is unacceptable, but going out of their way to add slurs against a European ethnicity that wasn't present in the original is totally fine. Again, they're both fine to me. It's a work of fiction, art basically. I'm never going to argue in favor of censoring someone's artistic vision. The double standard these localizers have is absolutely ridiculous and completely in line with that racism equals prejudice plus power bullshit. Most people consider the Irish to be white, so it's fine to say slurs against them, and most liberals will... Well, they usually consider Asians to be white, except when they're being oppressed by white people, then they don't count. But my point being, this is definitely the progressive stack in action in my fucking lawyer video game. I just wanted to solve murders, boss. So there's a lot more to Prosecutor's Gambit and the other Ace Attorney games, but like I said, I don't think I need to comb over every single line just to prove my point. The localization team made a lot of indefensible changes, and I'm not just talking about inserting a "this is Sparta" joke in 2024. I'm talking about the censorship. It's parasitic. These localizers are entrusted with conveying someone's art across linguistic borders, and what we get is a paused, censored, accessible version filtered through their political ideology rather than something authentic and honest. In case you're wondering, the head of the translation department is a non-binary Taiwanese American who's been with the series since the second game back in 2007 or whatever. Yeah, in case you thought I was giving the worst possible rating of these changes, I don't think it's any stretch to say that a woman who calls herself a they-them is going to lack the maturity and open-mindedness to faithfully translate a work from another culture without feeling the need to censor it and inject it with her own shit politics. And if you can believe it, Janet Shu more or less confirms everything I've complained about with the localization of Prosecutor's Gambit. She's written a few blog posts about localization on Capcom's site, and there's one article from about a decade ago titled Localization and Ace Attorney. A lot of it is just meandering about how it's okay to translate things inaccurately as long as they're emotionally accurate, which honestly reminds me of that Babylon Bee article about a fictitious Snopes rating called Factually Inaccurate but Morally Right. Anyway, the important part is here, where she goes on record explaining that she has a duty to change anything that could be considered culturally offensive, her words not mine, even if it's part of the text that she's supposed to translate. She even acknowledges that it could be considered censorship. So yeah, if you don't believe this chud on the internet when he says she censored Ace Attorney, here you go, an admission straight from the localization director. And keep in mind that this article was written over a decade ago, and that the English translations she's done for the series are used to create the translations for the French version, German version, Chinese, Spanish, Russian. Basically, for well over a decade, she's been censoring the script for the Ace Attorney series and then passing these neutered scripts on to everywhere that isn't Japan. Lovely. I suppose the only thing I'm shocked by is that we haven't gotten any of the characters turned into non-binaries like the Xenoblade 3 localization. Sort of. I'm going to divert again from Ace Attorney Investigations 2 to talk about the 5th game in the series. So there's one moment in the 3rd case where a supposedly male character suspected of wearing a woman's dress. Yeah, during a murder trial. It sort of makes sense in context. It turns out that he was actually a woman who was posing as a man because her parents wanted her, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, the first time the scene is translated, they actually say pretty true to the spirit of the original, from what I assume. Robin explains that he is a very macho guy and would never wear something girly like a dress, and the other characters agree that's such a portrait of masculinity wouldn't wear ladies' clothes. So then, when the game was re-released a year ago, the scene was reworked. Now, no character points out that it would be strange for a man to wear a dress. The argument hinges on a much weaker angle that Robin personally does not like dresses. Seriously? We can't even acknowledge that it's unusual for a man to wear a dress? I'm not afraid to say it, it's weird. Men and women have dramatically different physiologies, different muscle structure, skeletal structure. It's uncanny seeing a man wearing something suited for a female form. Beyond that, the vast majority of men psychologically would be repulsed by the idea of wearing women's clothes. It's not offensive to say that, it's just true. And the thing is, the 2013 version wasn't even going that far. Not once did it say, even in general, that a man wearing dresses was in any way negative, just that it was weird for that specific masculine acting character to want to wear one. Now think back to the localization director. Now, I don't know for a fact if she was the same person who went through and scrubbed the scene so thoroughly of any acknowledgement that a man wearing women's clothes is unusual. I don't think it's a stretch to assume that, you know, the non-binary localizer would take it upon herself to alter any dialogue that she felt alluded, however inoffensively, to a gender binary. Okay, one last tangentially related example before I wrap this up. Apollo Justice Ace Attorney also had a few changes alongside Dual Destinies when it was re-released last year. This next line was poorly translated originally too in order to insert a pop culture reference, So it could be that it was simply getting cleaned up, but well, think about the woman who heads the localization department and the way she and her ilk view a certain British children's author, and tell me why you think this line was changed. Using the door like an average muggle, no less, to, I exclaimed as he walked in through the door normally. Yeah, I'm putting my money on Rawling derangement syndrome for this one. You know, Persona and Danganronpa, despite having terrible fandoms, actually had all-right localizations. The games remained in Japan, even with Japanese textures being retained in clothing and stuff. They didn't try to Americanize the series, and you know what? Both were pretty popular, and in my opinion, Danganronpa mogs Ace Attorney in pretty much every way. I'm not a big Persona guy, but again, that one was mainstream enough to where it has representation in Smash, and that translation never tried to bullshit the audience into believing it takes place in America. What's my point here? You don't need to translate something to be accessible or emotionally accurate, and you definitely don't need to amputate anything culturally offensive. There's plenty of fiction that was translated generally pretty directly and is still beloved and enjoyed. Janet and the rest of the localization team have no excuse. They're not doing the game a favor by going for an accessible translation over an authentic one. To the contrary, actually, all they're doing is giving you a worse script, kneecapping the original author's work, while the director tells you that she's a good person for doing so. So I've gone over a few trends in the changes now and complained about the official translation being less accurate. But the fan translation also made some changes, and I've been way less critical to that. Why? Well, first, let me say that if you're translating something, you should know your place. Your job isn't to rewrite it. You should be altering as little of the original line as necessary in order to convey the spirit, intent, and function of the original. The thing is, the changes made by the fan translation team were done out of passion, not some trumped-up moral obligation they invented. They loved the game and the writing behind it. When they would make changes to the script, even as misguided as some were, it was always through the well-intentioned, if ignorant lens of how can I make this script that I love even better. The official localization team, though, their perspective is more, how can I make this script that I dislike actually good? They lack passion, too. There's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone loves their job. I know I don't. But between that and the fact that they're not above changing the meaning of lines for social justice reasons, I think it's clear they don't hold the same respect for the original script that the fan translation team did. And with that line crossed, all goodwill I've allotted them goes right out the window. When you start deciding what does and doesn't stay because of your political opinions, you've lost all right to call yourself a translator. Taking liberties with the script because it doesn't match your worldview isn't translation anymore, it's just propaganda. I don't care if you think you have to be inoffensive or to better connect with an ignorant audience. It means you fail as a translator. At that point, you're just barely a step above that AI on Reddit that translates books for mongoloids. You all probably thought I was exaggerating when I said this is basically the modern day equivalent of 4Kids, but look at this footage. It's the same scene I showed earlier. Notice anything? Yeah, that's right. That was the re-release with Fender offering a hot dog to Edgeworth. This is the original, where he's offering a California roll instead, a change made by the present-day localization department at Capcom. I'm serious. To this day, we're still getting overzealous localization teams overstepping and making completely unnecessary changes. It was shitty when 4Kids did this to anime, and it's shitty now. I take that back. It's a bit worse. The localization came out just over a year ago. We're in the modern age. I guarantee there are way more people today who know what a California roll is than there were people in the 90s who knew what an onigiri was. And even if they didn't know what a California roll was, they could just look it up, right? Or, I don't know, ask Grok or something. Who is this change for? Who are any of these changes for? The internet collectively laughed at 4Kids way back when, and rightfully so. The way they localized anime was comedically awful, calling onigiri donuts replacing cigarettes with lollipops, toning down violence. It was laughable, sure, but also straight up insulting to the original work and the audience. These people were put in charge of distributing creative works that, at the time, were a lot harder to get a hold of. What did they do with this trust? Well, they violated it, of course. They took it upon themselves to scrape off whatever they found problematic or inaccessible about it. Creative integrity be damned. Yes, I know a lot of their library was targeted towards kids younger than the demographic in Japan, but that doesn't matter. If you're toning down the content to appeal to be accessible to more people, that's still condescending as hell. You don't want to see kids getting confused by rice balls. That's retarded as is, but it's far from just idiot kids getting impacted by this. Think about it. Adults who otherwise would have wanted to see those shows had to suffer through inferior, censored, toned down, edges sanded off versions of something that they might have liked. And to this day, localizers like Capcom's team are taking it upon themselves to censor works you want to enjoy. Do you know what they're telling you when they do that? They're telling you that you're too immature to handle the script as it is, that you're too sensitive to be able to read it, that you're too to not rage if you see a piece of sushi you might not be familiar with. They're saying that you're a weak coward and need to be shielded from anything that has even the chance of making you uncomfortable or, God forbid, offended. And worst of all, they think they're virtuous for doing so. It should be insulting at the very least. I'd go out on a limb and say any well-adjusted adult should be offended with being condescended like that. You might want to believe we're far from that dumbass philosophy and localization that 4Kids use, but we're not. Prosecutor's Gambit, Ace Attorney in general actually, is a huge slant towards being accessible as opposed to being authentic, and it's impossible not to see a bit of 4Kids in there when they're replacing sushi with hot dogs. You know, believe it or not, there's one key difference between then and now. Now, people, when it suits their views, love censorship and over-localization. They celebrate it. They want fiction rewritten and artistic integrity quashed to match their delicate sensibilities and worldview. You know those changes to Eddie Fender I mentioned? Yeah, pretty much everyone in the fandom loves that the localization team went ahead and altered aspects of the original script. And don't get me started on the setting change from Japan to California. The supposed fans love that too. They love the cultural identity of the original slowly but surely being whittled away. I don't know how someone can call themselves a fan of the Ace Attorney series while simultaneously cheering for the original script being bastardized. I feel like every video I've made since then comes back to it, but it's a lot like what I mentioned in my Reddit video. The series and fan communities being more accessible means you get a bunch of fake fans who like the idea, the aesthetic of Ace Attorney, while also not really caring about the actual work or creative integrity of it. It's just content to them. They like the aesthetic of being an Ace Attorney fan, but only in as much as it matches their worldview. They won't accept it as is. It needs to be changed to match their normie standards. It's not just Ace Attorney, or even just video games in general, getting this shitty localization treatment either, as any real anime fan can tell you, but that's for another day. Look, I'm not going to say learn Japanese and play the original, because that's a big ask. It takes years and isn't even something I'd ask of myself. No, what I can ask you to do is firstly seek out fan translations and delocalization patches. A lot of major mod sites will suppress these, especially if they undo politically motivated censorship. They're absolutely worth looking for, if only out of respect for the original author. Secondly, and this is the big one, don't support games with localization teams like this. Don't give your money to people who hate not just you, but the original work you're trying to enjoy. Don't line the pockets of people who think you're too weak to consume fiction. We used to point and laugh at the dumbass localizers when they would remove cigarettes and guns from anime, and then we'd seek out an uncensored version to experience it how it was meant to be experienced. Given how ideologically captured most video game studios are, I doubt the censorship will end anytime soon. So maybe we should go back to pointing, laughing, and then looking for a means to enjoy the story in a way more aligned with how the artists, not localizers, intended. Anyway, that's about it for today. Do the thing the algorithm likes, and I'll see you later this month with my review of Once Upon a Katamari. Bye-bye.